speaker tonight, Bob Sandford. Bob Sandford is a 1990 graduate of the University of Dallas, which means that he'll be back next year for his 30th anniversary of graduating from the school. I knew Bob when he was an undergrad, and we met at a conference on the works of James Hillman a couple of years ago. And I've had the privilege of being able to follow the writing of this book that just came out a couple of months ago. If you want to, I'm going to keep this brief. If you want to find out more about his work in all the different areas, go to bobsanford.net, and there you'll find out some of the range of his creativity. It involves writing, including this book that titled up there on the board, essays and blogs, music. He composes jazz music. He gave me a copy of one of his CDs called Many Rooms a couple of years ago, and it's a brilliant, lovely piece of music. With how many different songs on there?
14 maybe.
14. Yeah, and he's done others as well. So we have writing and music. He's also done some sacred music. He also does woodwork and furniture building. And if you look at the cover of his book, there are copies of his books in the bookstore. If you look at it there, or you go online to order it, there's a piece of woodwork on the cover as part of the illustration there. And it's just magnificent. And he does photography, graphic design, and other things I don't even know about. But he's going to be talking about the creative process. And
thank you to the UD Psychology Department and the Office of Personal and Career Development for hosting this event. And special thanks to Dr. Kugelman for advocating for this talk and for his enthusiastic response and endorsement of my book. The title of which is up there, the subtitle we'll get to in a minute. Well, let's start with this. I never expected to write a book. Well, that I didn't expect to write. It seems to be fitting for a book about relating with those factors essential to creativity which seem to have a life of their own. Much of what found its way into the book was awakened in this place 20-something years ago, and that too was unexpected. And if not for the extraordinary friendship that has lasted twice that long, I never would have arrived here. So, book and alma mater came to me as gifts, and as with all gifts of immeasurable value, they laid claim to my heart, mind, and soul, and embracing this claim bore great fruit. And now, as the book is out, I am called upon to accompany it into the world. And that work in this place calls for an account of its beginnings. The origins of a creative work often show themselves only after the work is well underway and we pause to wonder, where is this coming from? The question, of course, is an opening for the source of the work to show itself. So I offer something like an ode to this place of origins. To love the soul or psyche is to love it everywhere it lives. And like life itself, it lives everywhere, even in the most unlikely places. It dwells in language, literature, poetry, ideas, history, music, art, architecture, dance, ritual, myth, and metaphor. And yes, psyche dwells even in psychology, and there, even when its logos is unfaithful to its namesake. Now, from our studies here in the humanities, we know that even when psychology is faithful, psyche will never find its full expression there, for like life itself, it lives in and speaks from every nook and cranny. Our creativity, which relies on our innate capacity for recognizing connection, shows that psyche is already transdisciplinary. And though our disciplines and institutions haven't quite embodied this yet, UD comes the closest I've seen. An education in the ways of cross-fertilization will awaken your creativity. Didn't know you were getting that here, did you? In this place where psychology is situated in a study of the humanities, psyche has a chance to speak, to sing, and dance in all its fullness. We create with the whole of who we are, so a living connection to the whole of your humanity will open up your creativity. Now for me, this place is the birthplace of an awakening to the life of soul, and as such it lives as a mythic space carved out by its architecture, incarnate in its art, its lectures, conversations, and relationships. Here I learned the generative and regenerative power of return to origins. What does that mean? Here we seek the roots of Western civilization. Here we encounter for ourselves primary sources and seminal thinkers. Here we seek first principles that form a solid foundation on which to build. This intention of going to what is first, to the root, the source, and the seed, is a return to the birthing of fields and schools and whole worlds. This sort of return opens the generativity of our creative nature. And so the subtitle of the book is Imagining the Source of Our Creativity. And that act of imagining the source of our creativity is a generative return, a sort of mythic act. So near the end of my time as a student here, a dream offered an image that has stayed with me, and in this place it helps tell the tale of the book's writing. I was shown this way into a space under a staircase. In the space was a file cabinet that held all the ideas that had took hold of me during my time here. I had the sense that these ideas would continue to work on me and call upon me to follow through with that work. I had no idea where that would lead. After years of creative practice, reading, and reflection, 4 years ago, I read an essay, An Approach to the Dream, by Patricia Berry, who is actually a UD alum, and realized that her approach to the dream was well suited to fostering a fertile relationship with the unconscious factors in creative acts. And just to situate her thought, Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud, and James Hillman, founder of what's called archetypal psychology, is an American psychologist, more contemporary. She was part of that movement of archetypal psychology, which is a branch of Jungian psychology, and that may or may not mean anything to you at this point, so you have to decide. Okay, Berry's rather phenomenological commitment to meet the dream on its own terms translated effortlessly to a fidelity to our creative nature. And for those of you who don't know, phenomenology is primarily a descriptive methodology. In other words, it tries to get to lived experience as it presents itself rather than imposing conceptual constructs and that sort of thing. So the native language of the dream and the creative impulse that comes to find out is image, metaphor, symbol, and myth. As a matter of fact, Carl Jung went as far as to write, image is psyche. Berry's essay offered an answer to the question of why so many drawn to regular creative practice are drawn to Jungian psychology. A Jungian approach to engaging our creative nature is inherently creative because it speaks psyche's language. I started writing an essay from this, but an essay could not hold it. I soon realized I had a book on my hands. So the image of the file cabinet lives in my practice of keeping books that grabbed me. And as I was writing, passages from those books, some of which I hadn't read in decades, came to mind. Trusting this, I searched, and more times than not, found the passages with notes scribbled in the margins that pertained directly to what I was writing. So here we're talking about the role of those unconscious factors, those memories that get internalized in ways that we're not even aware of. In one rather odd case, James Hillman's book, The Dream and the Underworld, I had read it years ago with great interest and took copious notes. And then mere days after reading it, I had little recollection of what I had read. Looking back, it makes me wonder who was reading. Apparently it affected me deeply because its ideas and images ran as an undercurrent in the writing and surfaced in the last chapter of the book in ways that took me by surprise. Incidentally, that chapter, The Dream Ego in the Dream, and the Waking Ego in Creativity, shows the extraordinary parallels between the two and explores how a poetic encounter with the dream ego as an image among images, opens our creativity. Okay. So, as for methodology, how I came to write the book, what was at the core of the book, I adopted a technique at the heart of the writings of Carl Jung, and that is called active imagination. When Jung parted ways with Freud, he was inundated with unconscious material, so much so that he struggled to find his bearings. He found a measure of consciousness, of insight, and peace by engaging the material in imagination. So here we have the creative process, a conscious material surfacing, and find the creative process being bringing peace, insight, understanding, and making room for those emerging contents. So creative expression became for him a way of relating to those emerging contents that met them on their own terms, a sort of first-hand research that formed the basis of his work. A Jungian approach to creativity works because creative expression is at the heart of his work. As Susan Rowland writes in Jung as Writer, his writing performs the creativity psyche. And that was what I was trying to do in my writing, not write about creativity so much as perform it in the writing. So my writing process included accumulated 100+ pages of active imagination journaling, dialoguing with the source of my creativity imagined in the feminine. To me, some of the most striking passages were almost verbatim from that conversation. And that relationship lives in the writing as an invitation into the same thing. So, in other words, using imagination to honor, make room for those autonomous factors in the creative process. Meeting them in imaginative dialogue, meeting them in some kind of creative expression is at the heart of this, and is at the heart of Jung's work. So one of the results of that is that relationship becomes the root metaphor of the book, both in terms of the content and the process. So again, at the center of creativity is this relationship with those factors that we can't explain, that we can't control, but we can relate to, we can open the way for. And as for content, our relationship with emerging relatively autonomous factors, let me say that again, emerging relatively autonomous factors is central to creativity, as I said. And as for process, the book as a created work embodies that relationship. Taking the metaphor of relationship further, I would say that creativity is defined not by the originality of its fruits, but by originality, that is an orientation toward an ongoing relationship with the source of our creativity. And that actually makes one whole chapter of the book. In this metaphor, we can speak of fidelity to the creative impulse, piety toward its source, and we can speak of creating with collaborative intent. So oftentimes what we create emerges and surprises us, and that's part of that relationship. And in the metaphor of relationship, we can entertain the kinship and interconnectedness of all things. And our creative nature is particularly apparent when we see connections everywhere. Okay. So in its subtitle, Imagining the Source of Our Creativity, is the running, that phrase is the running title inside the book because it speaks to a methodological thread that runs throughout. By imagining the source, that is, by poetically engaging the images it offers of itself, we open to a performance of our creative nature. Imagining it allows it to show itself. This is a participative knowing, a knowing by drawing closer and entering in. Even in reflection and analysis, I aimed to remain connected in a relationship more like dance partners than coroner and corpse. This makes the book more like performance art than exposition. The intention that emerged in the work was to embody creativity in the writing, in part by taking up psychological, philosophical, aesthetic discourse as genre and creative media that performs the creativity of psyche. What emerged was a poetics of creativity. Okay. So a word about imagining the source, the phrase the source. The source, the phrase, is intended as a heuristic fiction, that is, a way of knowing, a poetic way of knowing. It is a deliberately open-ended image that hopefully loosens our tendency to literalize just enough that honors the autonomy of the creative psyche and opens to mystery, a fitting stance toward what will ever exceed consciousness. Now, the flyer for this event that you may have seen plays with this image, and I'll read from it. From the flyer. What is that mysterious factor that gives rise to the creative impulse, to intuition, insight, and spontaneously offers solutions to creative impasses and guides creative work to completion? The question begins with wonder and moves quickly into fascination. Something has us. If we entertain the question, if we offer it hospitality and let it weave its tale, it opens to mythic imagination, the beginning of a performance of the mysteries of creation, and sets us on a quest for the source of our creativity. Where does it come from? Where does it dwell? How do I find my way there? This question of origins becomes a quest for a founding myth, a means for awakening and participating in the source's generative power. So you can see this is an imaginal knowing. We're not looking for answers, we're looking for an opening, a connection, a relationship, which can spawn some answers along the way. So what is awakened by the question is what stirs when we are creatively inspired. Now here's a hint of the timeless power of the founding myth that roots and awakens our creativity. So we're talking about founding myths of creation. Mircea Eliade in The Sacred and the Profane writes that a myth of origins, quote, tells of what is most essential and offers a path back to it. So here we are in a place where we are looking for what is most essential, right? And, quote, to the mythic mindset, a tale of origins is an invitation to participate in the mysterious, originating, creative energy embodied therein, as if for the first time. Creation stories serve as a paradigmatic model for every creation. So by following their pattern, you participate in their creative energies. So even as we seek a return to our origins seek a return to our living. So the more we relate to the source of our creativity, however we imagine that, the more it manifests in our everyday life, in our creative activities, and so on. Okay. Cosmogonic myths, that is, myths of the creation of the cosmos, hold the mysteries of creation to which we can return and participate in anew through ritual enactment. This return by enactment is fertile, generative, and regenerative. And there you can see, some of you know by creative practice, that is a healing practice also. Regenerative. So in this we can imagine our creative acts as ritual enactments of the first divine cosmic creative act. So, imagining the source of our creativity is an act of mythic imagination, a quest for a founding myth that tells what is most essential offers a path back to it, a way to participate in the mysterious, originating, creative energy embodied therein, as if for the first time, and have those origins inhabit our living and what we create. It's a lot to absorb. Yeah, okay. So, one of the ways to open to this sort of imaginative engagement, right, is by what you can call poetic hospitality. So this mythic space that we're talking about, this mythic space for an awakening, favors imagination over explanation. We kind of touched on that. Explanation as a gesture toward what is awakened by the question of origins. We seek to explain where our creativity comes from. We seek an answer. It's a gesture toward the source of our creativity that seeks an answer, an endpoint, and something to grasp. Whereas imagination as a mode of engagement is a gestural relationship, or a relational gesture, excuse me. Imagination seeks an opening to an ongoing relationship which takes us we know not where. So consider this poem. It's called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a white light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So poetic response opens our creativity, where beating with a hose, of course, shuts down creativity pretty quickly if you beat yourself with a hose. So if you're used to beating yourself up, that's one of the challenges of being creative, right? Is learning to let go of that and to trust something over which you have no direct control. Okay. Some 10 years after my time here, I left the field of psychology and continued creative practice with renewed energy. Well, I say, I studied, I left, I created, but the word doesn't circumscribe the experience of the emergent intentions in those acts. As with dreams, the most fitting language for this is image and metaphor. So, something other, likely the same something other that offered the dream of the file cabinet, was making demands on my energies toward unknown ends. I took Jung's approach and made room for that other intention to enter the work. Refusing this seemed to lead to misery, which is probably why Jung wrote that, quote, the unborn work in the psyche of the artist is a force of nature that achieves its end either with tyrannical might or with the subtle cunning of nature herself. This other intention unfolded not only as single created works, but as an arc and a body of work that somehow holds together. Returning to the field of psychology, I bring a work that seems like a psychology of creativity, but is closer to a creative work in the genre of psychology. So that going from psychology to creative practice becomes psychological, and psychology becomes a creative practice. All right, so in a second here, I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like. Okay, so in the spirit of the generative and regenerative return to origins, I offer a psychological concept saturated with mythic imagination. In the chapter in my book entitled The Idea of Archetypes, A Mythic Tale of Origins, I take Jung's idea of archetypes in the collective unconscious poetically by tending the images in the idea as an invitation to imagine the source of our creativity. So this move of attending the images and the ideas is part of what I mean by taking psychology as a creative medium. It's by searching out and engaging the images and the ideas. So let's talk first, obviously most of you don't know what that the collective unconscious and the archetypes mean. I'm going to start with the genesis of the idea to give you an idea where it's coming from. We start at the beginnings. Jung found out that once his patients had worked through much of their own unconscious material, their own personal unconscious material, mythological images began appearing in their dreams, though the patients had no prior knowledge of myths. The study of comparative mythology revealed certain themes that ran across history and culture. He began to suspect that there was an inherited collective layer of the psyche that was expressed in myth and dreams. And so I'm going to anticipate here, we're heading toward a way of imagining where our creativity comes from. Jung had the following dream. And in this dream, we're going to see that Jung's primary image of his thought, his way of imagining the psyche, is through the metaphor of depth. He had the following dream. I was in a house I did not know, which had 2 stories. It was, quote, my house. I found myself in the upper story where there was a kind of salon furnished with fine old pieces in Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings, and I wondered that this house should be mine and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground floor, and there everything was much older. I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval, the floors were of red brick, everywhere it was rather dark. I went from one room to the other, thinking, now I must really explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it, I discovered a stone stairway that led down into a cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew the walls dated from Roman times. My interest now was intense. Looking more closely at the floor, it was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and again I saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down to the depths. These too I descended and entered a low cave cut in rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old, half disintegrated. Then I awoke. So this dream informs his thought quite a bit. The images in it, as we said at one point, his interest was now intense. So we'll depart from the script for a second. So again, his primary metaphor of his psychology is that of depth. What is deeper is older, comes first. So the deeper you go, the closer you get to the origins of the very birth of consciousness. And interestingly enough, in dreams, he hypothesized that the older it was on the evolutionary scale, that there was a worm compared to a human being, the worm would be older and more primitive, more lower down in the structure of the psyche. Okay. Now I want to look at the images in the idea of archetypes. So for our purposes here, the idea of the collective unconscious is an invitation to imagine our source of creativity, imagine the source of our creativity. We hear and accept the invitation by engaging the images in the idea. So, as we said, the central metaphor is depth. The layers of the psyche, conscious, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, okay, which is transpersonal, which to him explained why mythic images that people didn't previously have any knowledge of appear. Okay. And so the collective unconscious is the foundation of psyche and its creativity. So here's a passage that gives you an idea, sort of an imaginative expression of this layer, this source of our creativity. He wrote that in the collective unconscious is found, quote, the hidden treasure upon which mankind has ever and anon drawn, from which it has raised up its gods and demons and all those potent and mighty thoughts without which man ceases to be man. He spoke of it as the inherited possibilities of human imagination as it was from time immemorial. Okay, so he also spoke of archetypes being separate from the archetypal images that they manifest. So the images would be the mythological images that would manifest in dreams and so on. But that there was a source that was unknowable, that was prior to that. So by doing that, he introduced some philosophical problems, but he also introduced, more importantly, the notion of mystery, that the source of our creativity, the source of psyche, is a mystery. Okay. That attitude of mystery loosens the grip of egoic fantasies of mastery and opens to imagination. So again, we talked about those autonomous factors in creativity. Sometimes when you're faced with them, in order to make room for them, you have to give up your sense of mastery, like I'm in control of the situation. It's more like, okay, what do I do with this? How do I relate to it? How do I make sense of it? How do I honor it? So that's a different response than trying to master those creative impulses, those images that come up from the deep side. So here's some characteristics of archetypes in his thought. And you can hear the images and the idea here. First, they're a priori, pre-personal, we addressed that. They're ancestral, they're inherited possibilities of imagination. They are like primordial images or blueprints. Archetypes originate from repeated patterns of experience, not here understood as the passive witnessing of literal events, but patterns of the ways we made sense of events. They're not so much ideas as the possibility of ideas, and, quote, the greatest and best thoughts of man shape themselves upon these primordial images as upon blueprint. Types are self-perpetuating and self-replicating. They are relatively autonomous, and an encounter with them strikes us to the core. So, we can get in a creative space where we feel like what we're doing is very personal, which even when there's collective energy there, it still is very personal, right? But there's also an element to creative expression that comes from a deeper place that is greater than oneself, right? And that's partly where the sense of transcendence in the creative act comes from. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how that figured, as an example, to give you a sense of how that figured into my writing of the book, I'll start in the middle of the story. When I was about 2/3 of the way to a complete first draft, this came clearly in my journaling. It was time to make it real. This, I understood, is to mean it was time to stop just writing in an isolated way, connected to books, to my creative practice, and make it real, bring it out into the world, connect it somehow. Okay. Now again, that came from the journaling, it came from somewhere else. It wasn't me saying this. But as soon as I heard it, I knew there was a certain conviction to it that it was time. So what did I do? So I emailed Susan Rowland, who is chair of the Pacifica Graduate Institute's master's program. And here's the title: Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life. That sounds like a unique program, right? All right, so in the email I pitched her the book and told her I would be at Pacifica soon for a conference and would like to talk with her. She said it sounded fascinating, thank goodness, and she agreed to meet. Well, when we met, by the end of the conversation, to my surprise and delight, she said she'd like to read the first draft and that she might use it for her program. So here was the beginnings of a sense that the work was more than just about me, that it had a value beyond just my own personal reflection. And honestly, before I even got to that point, I had that conviction. To have that confirmed was powerful. Okay. And we talked about possible publishers, and she recommended additional reading. Now this is where we get to some of the collective aspects of it, because the reading set my hair on fire. So I bought a few of those books she recommended, and my departure out of California was delayed a day. That worked out. I started reading. Before this point, I did have a clear sense of the inspiration of the book was collective in nature, like I said. But talking about an encounter with archetypal realities that strike me to the core, as I read, passage after passage sent waves through my body. I had to repeatedly stop and catch my breath. What I was reading and what I was writing arose from the same collective energy. I felt connected to a community bound by a common call. I was convinced more than ever that this work was not quite mine, but was mine to do. I was energized to push to a first draft, enriched by the material, and it deepened the writing considerably. I'll share one of the books was The Unconscious Roots of Creativity. Interesting. So it's a book, a collection of essays on the role of the unconscious in creativity. It was just a fabulous collection of essays. And again, when I was reading it, it was such a confirmation, and to hear it echoed in other voices from other perspectives was powerful. As a matter of fact, the first publisher I saw was Chiron Publications, who put out that book. I could just visualize my book on the same shelf right next to it. But they didn't bite it. Later when Routledge picked it up, they were interested. But it was too late by then. So, when I sent the manuscript to Susan, she read it in half the time that she had promised. That made it easier. While I was dying, we didn't know. Her response was beyond hope. She began this for me. Thank you for allowing me to read your astonishing book. I had to catch my breath and just lay on the floor and just breathe for a while. She actually said it was ready to be sent to the publisher, and that I could tell them she would endorse it and use it in her program. So that was just powerful. And there's more to her advocating for it, which I deeply appreciate. And for those of you who've been around long enough, Dr. Romanishin, Bob Romanishin, I studied with here. He ended up at Pacifica, and they were colleagues. And I recently actually got to see a presentation with him and her co-presenting the topic, which was fabulous. So, in the writing, I became convinced that our creative nature is our collective heritage. Being true to that heritage brought into sharp relief many collective preoccupations that hinder our creativity and offer a way to heal these. It also has the potential to deepen our relationship, that is, being faithful to our creative nature. Has the potential to deepen our relationship to the body, the feminine, to nature, and the cosmos, and lead us to feeling more at home in the world. I wish there was more time for me to tell you how that happens. You might have to read the book. All right. So I found that our creative nature is so essential to who we are that by embracing it, we embrace the whole of our humanity. Well, I hope you find that relationship and that transformative journey that birthed the book is embodied in the book as an invitation to the same, because that's how I came to understand creative work, that coming out of a relationship with its source, that relationship becomes embodied in the work in such a way that it lives as an invitation to the same. So I'll give you an example. It's part of the script. So when you were before a photograph, for example, one that grabs you in some way, okay? The effect of that, we're not talking about photography as if it's just a representation of exactly the truth of what was there, just pixels or photons on the retina or anything like that. We're talking about photography as an art of engaging the world and finding ways to communicate that engagement through the art. Okay? So part of what happens in a powerful photograph is that when we're before it, when we're susceptible to it, we're open to it, it affects us in deep ways in which both touch who we are as individuals but go beyond that. So in a sense, the work of art invites us into the same relationship that birth did by almost figuring us as the artist standing before the work. So the same relationship, and this is developed through the book, but understanding that the creative work is that it embodies the relationship that birth did and stands as an invitation into that relationship. So if you happen to be somebody who's in the right place, is susceptible to it, and are before it, and are affected deeply by it, chances are you are being affected by it, you are being invited into feeling it, bodily way, that invitation into that act. I'll give you an example. Okay. Yeah, we're doing fine. Okay. I had a friend report this story. So a friend of hers sent a picture of this installation art. It was simply 2 clocks on a wall. One of them was at a different time than the other. And she, for no known reason, burst into tears. It struck her on a deep level. For some reason, she had no idea what was going on. She looked into the nature of the art, the story behind it. Well, the art was done by an artist who, the idea of the art, first of all, was to put both battery-operated clocks on the wall, set at the exact same time, and set them going, and there was no telling which one would stop first. Part of what was going on there in the artist's life was that he had a partner who was dying of AIDS, and so he was very aware of their partnership, their friendship, their love, had a limit, and there was no telling which one would go first. So the mortality was embodied there. And it turns out my friend who reacted in such a way is married to someone quite a bit older, and there's always this ticking clock in the sense of how long are we going to be able to be together. So that to me speaks volumes. And that, actually, I wrote an essay about that very story that's a little more in depth on my website, which is listed up there. So, okay, at this point we're ready to give any questions. I'm happy to try to answer them. Well, let me ask this. How many of you are artists, would identify as artists, are in the art program, do some kind of creative expression in your life? So, yes. Cool, and how many are psych majors? There's probably overlap there. Good, excellent. Good to have you here. Yeah. Well, if you're a psych major, I hope you find this place just as meaningful and transformative as I did. Any questions? Any experiences you want to relate? Anything that resonated with you? Yes, please.
So I'm curious as to what you think regarding how, in someone's life, how suffering affects one's imagination. In regards, like everybody kind of has an overall familiarity with imagination and how one's suffering affects that.
That's an interesting question. Trying to find a place to start. Well, one thing I'll say about suffering is if you do it well, it has a way of deepening your connection to your own humanity. You can tell somebody in their eyes sometimes, by looking into their eyes, that they've been through a lot in life, and that they've somehow managed to grow from that. It's made them more compassionate, more empathetic. And I think the more that you are connected to your own humanity, through suffering or however, the more you're connected to your own humanity, the more rooted you are, and the more creative you can be. One thing interesting to me is that Yo-Yo Mama, the cellist, international reputation, fabulous musician, I've got to see him perform twice now. And he actually studied and got an advanced degree in the humanities, which shows in his playing. I swear it shows in I didn't know that before I was fascinated just by his presence on stage. So I'll tell you a story. So he came on stage and got tremendous applause. We're in Kansas City, and it's rare. He's been there a couple times. Everybody's just so glad that he was there. And he walked in, sat down eventually, and then just turned around, looked at the audience, and got this huge smile on his face. Everybody started giggling. And then the director turned around and looked at him and said, well, he's glad to be here. And it was just this human moment, right? But then when he plays, there's just this sense that he's giving himself to something that's far beyond himself, something that we all participate in. And that in that art, in that expression, is an opportunity to open to and experience something that binds us all as human beings and connects to our humanity. So, yeah, that would be probably the most creative answer I could give to the question of suffering and creativity, because I think it can deepen us and make our creative work as well as just our lives as a whole more impactful, richer. Anything else? Did that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
So, you mentioned that, trying to see if I wrote down, basically, would you say that your book is, in the way that you were talking about Aristotle's Poetics, that it's almost like trying to categorize and define creativity, or is it more trying to give, I guess, a broader, just kind of examples of it? What is your goal of the book?
Yeah, so as far as the act itself of categorizing, the question is whether my book categorizes and defines creativity. Is that basically?
Yes.
So one of the things I do in the book, and this goes a long way toward learning how to think creatively, is I look at categorizing and conceptualizing and theoretical systems itself as a creative activity. So rather than taking those activities, well, literally, I guess you could say, I take them more imaginatively. So for example, a concept, you can take it in this metaphor of relationship, you can take a concept in terms of its gestural value. Okay, so how does this, like a psychological concept, I can't think of one right now, but if you take that concept in terms of how does this situate me in relationship to my own humanity, right? There are some concepts, like in the metaphor in cognitive psychology, sort of ode to Scott Churchill back there. The metaphor in cognitive psychology of the information processing system, right? So input, output, and so on. So those concepts in them can have metaphors that, if you take them literally, become very reductive. If you reinvigorate them by recovering them as metaphors, as ways of seeing, ways of experiencing, and you recover them as creative acts, and you loosen them up in a way where you don't get caught in a reduction. Yeah. So I think as long as you see psychology itself as a creative activity, then you steer clear a lot of the reductive tendencies that can be. Sometimes it's really tempting in an egoic mode, if we were talking about relationship. If you favor ego over the rest of psyche, right? If you're in egoic mode, then your conceptualizing can be about the egoic project of mastery, right? I want to master this, I want to know it, I want to be able to control it, I want to be able to change this and manipulate that. That often doesn't work too well when we're dealing with human beings, partly because it only involves a certain aspect of what it means to be human, not the whole of what it means to be human. Does that get close to your question? Yeah, good, thanks. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned the creative myths being important to how we create. Are there certain images in the creative myths that are more important than others, or those that speak more creatively than others?
Well, James asked the question of creation myths and their connection to creativity, and whether certain creation myths have greater creative value or potential, I suppose you could say. I wouldn't prioritize one over another. I'd be hesitant to do that, because I think mythologizing itself is imagining the source of our creativity. That activity, I think, is itself creative. So I wouldn't say that there's any one that's better than any of the others. There are some, though, that tap into some collective unconscious material that has, whenever you tap into aspects of our humanity that have been pushed aside, pushed out of consciousness, repressed, however you want to imagine that. Whenever you deal with those have the greatest creative potential. And so I'll give you an example. So one of the pieces that I developed in the book is from Barry and Cashford's Myth of the Goddess, which is a wonderfully detailed book about creation mythologies and their change from, their shift from what is they generally categorize as Earth Mother creation mythologies, where Earth Mother creates of her own substance everything that remains connected, interconnected as kin, and returns to her. So that, in a general way of imagining creativity, is kind of interesting, and I developed that because that creation myth is fairly forgotten, actually, except maybe in Gaia imagery, Gaia mythology, and ecology, and that sort of thing. So I use that quite a lot because part of what strikes me about creativity, like I mentioned before, is being the capacity to see the interconnectedness of all things, to see connections, especially among most unlikely things. So transdisciplinarity, for example, studying multiple disciplines. And let's say you're in philosophy class and you learn something that relates directly to what you just heard in psychology class. Or in the case of Dr. Kugelman's classes where we're reading Greek philosophy to understand childhood in that time. That cross-fertilization is very creative. So if you're in one way you can think of creation mythologies is they also represent a state of consciousness, a way of being aware, right? So being aware of the interconnectedness of all things, how all things are kin, it opens you to a particular way to see connections where there weren't connections before. And that is a pretty creative move. And it also has the advantage of connecting us to nature, to each other. And there's a lot of benefits of recovering that creation mythology